Myers.
Just Mama, Linda, Chip, Cindy, Michael, Princess, Walton McQueen, Deborah Cornavaca. Is Deborah.
Log in just so they, so Jeffrey.
Good evening, everyone. I just asked that if you're not speaking, that you mute yourself. We are getting ready to start the program in just a bit. So.
The best of history and drama every Sunday night on PBS. My grandparents.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. We'll give it one more minute to allow people to join us. Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to the PCDO's panel discussion on investment versus austerity, government response to economic downturn. This promises to be an informative program. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to acknowledge PCDO's Programming Committee Chair, Tim Quinn, for all his great leadership. And I just ask that if you're not speaking, that you please mute yourself. Thank you. Tim, thank you for all your great leadership in general of the Programming Committee, but in particular for all your work on this month's program. You've done a truly fantastic job all around. I also want to recognize the members of the Programming Committee, former Princeton Mayor Liz Lempert, Princeton Councilwoman Mia Sachs, PCDO Nominating Committee Chair Jeffrey Oakman, and PCDO Executive Board members Michael Floyd and Dina Shaw for all their contributions to tonight's program. Thank you all. It is my honor to moderate tonight's program. The panel will explore the role of government when the public sector loses revenue during economic downturns. Is it a time for greater investment or belt tightening? With the federal government making robust investments in public goods on a scale not seen in decades, the panel will explore whether this is a time for state, county, and municipal government to invest in public goods or cut budgets and curtail capital expenditures. The panel will explore the implications of austerity for people who rely on government services, such as public schools, parks, and libraries, and nutrition programs. As always, we ask you to post your questions in the chat box for our audience Q&A portion, which will be moderated by our Programming Committee Chair, Tim Quinn. And so with that, we're going to get started, and I am going to invite all of our panelists to join me here on our virtual stage. Great, welcome esteemed panelists. So we're thrilled to have you join us tonight. It's my honor to introduce Sheila Reynerston, a senior policy analyst at New Jersey Policy Perspectives, who focuses on budget and tax issues with an emphasis on advocating for state fiscal policies that benefit working families. Sheila's research interests include budget planning, corporate taxation, progressive taxation policy, supportive work family policies, and women's economic empowerment. Sheila, I'm going to invite you to share your opening thoughts on our topic tonight, and you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Afshin. It's nice to be here tonight. As Afshin said, I'm Sheila Reynerston. I work at New Jersey Policy Perspective, which is a nonpartisan think tank that drives policy changes to advance economic, social, and racial justice through evidence-based, independent research, analysis, and strategic communications. We develop innovative policy ideas, and we
My bad, Sheila was muted by accident. Sorry.
It's okay. I'm back.
All right, good.
So, a policy perspective, we strive to develop these policy ideas that affect everyday New Jerseyans, right? So many New Jerseyans struggle to have the basic building blocks of a life, a decent place to live, education, good supporting jobs, childcare, healthcare, transportation, and other essential needs to secure a life of prosperity. And so for many years, New Jersey policy perspective have really pushed back on leadership to say these policies have really fallen short. We fail to adequately raise the required revenue and make the public investments necessary to break down structural barriers and put prosperity within everyone's reach. And this moment in time right now is pretty dramatic to be facing a next budget at the state level in 2022. Flush with cash, and it's been pretty exciting to be at the forefront of why that is and why it's sorry. That was the train going by. You know, it's the silver lining of the pandemic. New Jersey obviously is facing enormous health and economic challenges fighting this pandemic, and yet the state has really risen to the occasion. It's caused an unexpected increase in state and local spending that have really been an important factor to not only address the immediate needs, but to make sure that we are pushing forward to an economic recovery that will be sustained in the long term, right? And now we have the federal government also finally an instrumental part of that solution to provide relief to states, to provide relief to local governments, to you know, through this understanding that when you invest, you are going to recover at a faster rate and a more robust rate, right? Large cuts would erode the health and social infrastructure that we need to continue combating the pandemic and, you know, increase inequalities and exacerbate the economic downturn. So instead of budget cuts, instead of federal government holding back, we are pushing forward to address many different sectors of society to make sure that those who need it the most can get it, and those who have been hurt the most we can help them get back on their feet. And growing evidence supports this idea that when you invest, when you raise money rather than cut the social and physical infrastructures that will be necessary to protect the health and economic well-being of our people and our communities and our state, you just have a better overall economic recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila, and thank you for all your work at New Jersey Policy Perspectives to advocate on behalf of our most vulnerable communities. We're truly grateful and thrilled to have you here with us tonight. Next, it's my honor to introduce Deborah Cornavaca, who is the Deputy Chief of Staff of Outreach for New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy. Deborah previously served as statewide organizing expert at the New Jersey Education Association. She specializes in building statewide campaigns and coalition building with educators, advocacy organizations, parents, faith-based leaders, and community members. Deborah's work includes both issue and electoral campaigns ranging from community schools to the gubernatorial race. Deborah, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Afshin. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here this evening. To Tim and my fellow panelists, it's a true honor. And I note that this is a panel of women right now in our screen, which is a wonderful thing, and I think does bring a perspective to policy and politics that we should be elevating. So I appreciate that, Afshin. To the mayor, who I see is here, to council members and other elected officials, we thank you for the time to serve that you've brought, and also for being here this evening. But most importantly, to the residents of Princeton who have chosen to take time out of your busy days and evenings to join one more Zoom meeting rather than an in-person one, but to join one more Zoom meeting to take the time to think about this issue and figure out how to engage. Really the deepest of gratitude to all of you, because I think the theme that will carry out through all of my remarks this evening, which is reflective of the work that I have the privilege to do for the governor, is that our participation in the processes of investment, of recovery, whether it be economic or health, is critical to the success of achieving equity. That if we sit by the sidelines while this happens, it would be a slight definition of insanity to expect a different result if we do it the same way we've always done it. And so I think it's more critical than ever that we're fully engaged in the processes of the next months and years ahead of us in terms of how we come out of the pandemic to carve a path forward. As President Biden would say, build back better, as the governor would say, a path forward. My work for the governor is largely centered around making sure that at the highest levels of decision-making in his office, he has a full bench of people who are bringing ideas, policies, suggestions, concerns to the inner governor's office in a way that is reflective of all of New Jersey's diversity. It is not okay for him to sit in an office in isolation in Trenton, advised by a small group of people, and think that we know what's best for everybody across New Jersey. And it's a daunting task because we love the diversity in our state, but that means that there are diverse needs and there are diverse ways to approach fulfilling those needs. And so that's something that through the work that I do along with my team, we try to make sure is always present in the discussions that we have in the governor's office. And so we also rely very heavily on your input. So I'm looking forward this evening to hearing your questions and your thoughts, to being able to take back the perspective of this community to the governor's office, to our decision-making process. And, you know, I think if I could, Afshin, I will say that my guess is there's a large bias here towards the need to invest our way out of a crisis, not austerity, but how we do it, I think, is the really important piece to drill down on, and how we do it to undo systemic and structural racism, how we do it to address systemic sexism, and to lift up voices that have been marginalized, to make sure that everybody gets a piece of a growing pie, not just that the pie grows bigger. These are the real challenges that are put in front of us. And I will guarantee that we stand a better chance of success with all of your involvement. So thank you for the opportunity to be here to join this discussion, but most importantly, to learn and to hear from all of you to better inform the work we're doing with Governor Murphy.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, the outreach of your office has been phenomenal during this pandemic, and just kudos to you for involving people in the decision-making process, but also for informing us as those decisions are made and on rollout of different decisions and programming that's occurring during this pandemic. And so kudos to the governor's office and to you for your leadership on that front. With that, it's my honor to introduce our next panelist, Nedia Morsey. She's the organizing director at Make the Road, New Jersey. She supervises organizations Youth Power Project, the Student Success Center, and Make the Roads organizing committees in Elizabeth, Perth Amboy, and Passaic. She has been named one of the Insider New Jersey's top millennial leaders of 2018 and 2019, and is the former Institute Chair for New Jersey Leaders Council, New Jersey. In 2020, she was nominated by Governor Murphy to participate in the Student Success Working Group of the Office of the Secretary of Higher Education. Nedia, welcome, and you have the floor.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation, and thanks everyone for making time Sunday night. My name is Nedia, and I am the organizing director at Make the Road. Make the Road is a grassroots member-led organization headquartered in Elizabeth, but with satellite offices in Passaic and Perth Amboy. Like I mentioned, we are member-based and member-focused, and so the issues that our members bring to our weekly comité meetings every single week is really what drives the organization and informs the work. Just in this last year, even though we were virtually entirely shut down, we were able to mobilize more than 21,000 people and able to provide direct services to more than 15,000 families. Really excited about our growing movement here in New Jersey. And I think, just in the question of investment versus austerity tonight, I think, investment is sort of a question of racial justice, of economic opportunity, and the community's survival, Black and Brown people's community's survival. I think just to start, folks have probably already seen this stat, but before the pandemic, white families in New Jersey had the highest median net worth in the country, $352,000, while Black and Latinx families had a median net worth of $6,100 and $7,300 respectively. And during the pandemic, Black and Latinx people's hospitalization rate in New Jersey were twice as high as their white counterparts. And they've had the highest job loss. Latinx men actually make up half of all of the deaths of people under the age of 50, even though they only make up 12% of the entire population. And I think, it's very deep. I'll actually link the article in the chat. There's a WNYC piece that actually, underscored the fact that we've here in New Jersey, lost a generation of fathers. And so when we're thinking about investment, incredibly important that we're, investing in bold and transformative ways to prevent the worst racial and economic inequality crisis of our century.
Thank you, Nedia, for your commitment to equity and justice, and for all you're doing with your team at Make the Road New Jersey to advance equity in our state of New Jersey and beyond. With that, we're going to dive right in with the PCDO's question and then move into our audience Q&A. As a reminder to our audience members, please post your questions in the chat box, and we will be, our Programming Committee Chair Tim Quinn will be moderating our audience Q&A portion. And so we'll be looking for your questions and asking them as we get to that part of the program. The first question for our panelists is, with the federal government investing in public goods at a scale not seen in 40 years, and given State Treasurer Liz Muñoz's comment that New Jersey has chosen to invest our way out of the current crisis, do you believe similar investment at the county and local levels are equally important? And if so, why? So Sheila, would you like to get us started with that?
Sure. Yes, local governments investing in public goods at this moment is definitely the way to go, because it's a pretty easy recipe, right? Most local investment has to do with capital improvement projects, infrastructure projects, water, sewage, the like. And when you make that contract happen, you put people to work, they benefit, the suppliers benefit for that capital improvement project. The users eventually, when that, let's say rec center is finished, the users benefit, the community benefits, and jobs in that new facility. That's just the recipe for growing a local economy, right? You get money into the pipeline, and it multiplies across the community as they take those jobs and as they spend the money from their jobs. It's a win-win for everybody, and even more so, you see the benefits of it on the local level more so than on the state level in this particular recipe.
Thank you, Sheila. Deborah?
So yes, I concur with Sheila. I think it's obviously critical that as we invest at the state level, that investment is mirrored and comes into local communities, right? State investment is only going to be successful if it helps lift up local communities. In New Jersey, probably more than everywhere, because of the hyper local nature of our state's politics and economies. Right, we can only do it at the state level now, finally, because we started it in last year's budget. We knew going into last year's budget, even with the borrowing, that we had a deep commitment to invest, but the real investment comes now that the federal government's investing. So when the federal invests, the state invests. When the state invests, the counties and the municipalities ought to invest. I think the challenge comes in how it's invested. There are always pockets of lost revenue we can fill, and plugs, holes we can plug, and things that we maybe had been on, the back burner that we can lift up and do, and COVID recovery. But I would just challenge all of us to think about this in two critical pieces. One is, how do we layer the support, right? So certain things are going to be done by the state or the county. So what is the niche that municipal level support has to live in to provide the best benefit for their residents that won't be fulfilled by county or state? And I'll say as a corollary to that the local municipalities should be lobbying hard of county and state to make sure that they get the funds they need to do the things that are necessary. And that the second piece is that we use the opportunity for relief, yes, for immediate COVID relief, for recovery, but also for reimagination. And I shamelessly borrow from Bill Rogers here, who gave me those 3 R's to remember, that what we don't want to do is utilize this money in a way that gets us through a really great generous relief package, but that a year from now, we're kind of back where we were 15 months before the pandemic. We want to make sure we support relief. We want to make sure we put us on a long-term sustainable path to recovery. And that recovery, I encourage us to think about where we can reimagine, because we're going to have funds to invest in ways to start doing new and different that we usually don't. We very often say it would be great to do X, but we don't have the money to start it. So we're just going to have to keep doing what we've always done. Here's an opportunity to reimagine. So I think that the municipalities definitely are part of the critical success of this money coming in from the federal government, from the state and county, and down to the streets within a community. And those community voices have to be part of defining what it looks like to envision 5 or 10 years from now. How did we get through this pandemic, not just with a cash infusion that helped us recover, but how we got to a better place using the investment money that we have. If we don't do that, I fear we will have lost an opportunity. If we do that, I think we stand a really great chance of bringing a new kind of equity and justice, racial, social, and economic justice to our communities.
Thank you, Deborah. And Nedia, you have the floor.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, just to piggyback off Sheila and Deb, you know, there are like deep and entrenched inequalities that have just become even deeper because of the pandemic. You know, for example, you know, our state has sheltered in place on the backs of essential workers, many undocumented, and immigrant New Jerseyans who are out of status have yet to receive you know, a penny in unemployment or stimulus. And I think, you know, to your question, Kathleen, about like, how can we talk about benefits to undocumented immigrants as an investment? You know, one, it's a public health issue, right? If people feel like they have no other choice but to go to work so that they can afford the rent or pay the next bill or attempt to make the next bill, they're going to do that, even if they have a cough or somebody that is working with them in the assembly line also has a cough, right? And, you know, it's also a preventative measure, right? You know, we are in an eviction moratorium, but that doesn't stop landlords from harassing their tenants. You know, we actually conducted a survey of more than 230 of our members at Make the Road New Jersey residents, and 1 in every 8 of them said that they had experienced threats from their landlord, right? So either knocking every day, calling every day, right? Putting exorbitant late fees, right? And so, you know, we are potentially headed into, you know, a massive housing crisis because there are folks that are 6 months behind on the rent, 7 months behind on the rent, have made the decision to, you know, I'll pay the internet bill so my kid can have quality internet to stay connected, and I'll pay the food and the groceries for times when the pantry is too long or I can't make it there after work, but I'm not going to spend it on rent because I think I'm going to get evicted anyway. So, you know, these are like hopefully helpful ways as you're talking to others about, you know, supporting, you know, a campaign for recovery for all. And I think it's really important to add, and I think Sheila mentioned this at the top, that, you know, even though we're flush with revenue, you know, we have to continue tax equity here, taxing the wealthy, taxing corporations. You know, so many are coming out of this pandemic richer, with so many people completely devastated. And I will drop in the chat a report that we had actually done with NJPP that showed that, you know, 6 of the 8 billionaires that live in New Jersey actually got richer during the pandemic, which is like kind of mind blowing, you know, but, you know, really demands, you know, bold transformative measures, bold transformative investments so that we are coming out of this pandemic stronger, safer, and faster.
Thank you, Nedia, and all of you for sharing your thoughts on that. And we are in dire straits, and many people are hurting right now. And with that, I'm going to ask my next question, which is, who benefits when local governments invest in public goods, and how are they hurt during times of austerity? Nedia, do you want to get us kicked off with that?
Yeah, for sure. You know, I think I can talk a little bit about, you know, recovery for all. Some folks may already be familiar. You know, since the pandemic has started, our members at Make the Road and, you know, members at immigrant-led organizations across the state have really been campaigning for, you know, recovery for all, access to unemployment, access to stimulus-like payments, for members who have been excluded from relief. That's a little over 500,000 undocumented people, and then 200,000 plus US citizen children. You know, and we're really looking on the state and the local government to provide, you know, aid to excluded workers. We've had, members who have, sold all their valuables to attempt to keep up with the rent and have been unable to, right? We've had members who have lost their partner and are now alone, single and looking for work in a pandemic and trying to stay afloat, right? And these are folks that are not eligible for federal aid, not eligible for unemployment, and not really knowing what is going to happen. And I think the same way that all of us started off with this pandemic that Monday morning when the state shut down and thinking, how long will this last? Walked up to their warehouse and there was a sign on the door that said, we're closed this week. And then, our members calling us and saying, I went back to my place of work. There's still a sign that says they're closed. I don't know when this is going to end. And folks trying to hunker down, but not having any sort of, emergency reservoir that can not only be, and economically exhausting, but also mentally exhausting, right? We've had members who have experienced, mental health crises as a result of the financial insecurity and not knowing what's going to happen next. And I think, this attempt to win recovery for all, is an investment for all of us, right? All of this money will go back into a community, to small businesses where our members spend their money. And the legislature has been completely inactive, right? There was a bill once upon a time, before 2021, you're at the tail end of 2020, that would have provided close to 35 million in aid. But there hasn't been sort of a second round of that. There hasn't, been, efforts to bring that conversation back up. And recently the governor has made an announcement that he is, considering and looking at, opportunities to invest federal funds. And that's incredibly encouraging. And he deserves a lot of credit for that when there are undocumented immigrants across the entire country that are experiencing the same crisis that we're experiencing here. And we need, real relief. We need to sort of go big to meet this very scary moment of people not having a way of making it to tomorrow. New York just 2 weeks ago passed a fund for excluded workers that was $2.1 billion. And, we can meet the same moment here and hopefully do something just as big. But yes, and Deb deserves so much credit for doing all this liaising between community groups like Make the Road and the governor's office. This is a really dicey issue. One that we're pressing on, and hopefully we can also get the legislature to act.
And that'd be fantastic if we could really get to our most vulnerable communities and provide, some level of protection from this pandemic to all. Sheila, you have the floor.
Thank you. So the question is, who benefits when local governments invest in public goods and as opposed to austerity? And I think we all know that, like, when we're able to invest in local services, well, for instance, when the next package of relief comes into our towns, the flexible aid will provide COVID-19 related relief, including paying for expenses or covering lost revenue from last year. We're talking about getting vaccines into the arms of our community members, but it's also really a big chunk of it is keeping public workers employed, like essential public workers, like police officers and firefighters, teachers, and other essential workers on the job. In addition to maintaining services and helping small businesses that were hit so hard, because the other side of that is, if you don't, then you're looking at really a situation where you're limited in what you can do, right? You can pay off debt because the money lenders are not going to go anywhere. You're going to have flat funding across the board, even though costs have gone up. It's just essentially austerity is not the time for state or federal government to be in a position when they could do so much more, right? There's an opportunity, like Deb was saying, that we can't squander. And so any decisions we make in the next 3 years, we have to keep in mind that local governments are going to have to be in a better place when the 3 years is up, but also not be facing a fiscal cliff when those 3 years of investment is over, right? So it's a tricky situation where we we are being asked to invest into our local infrastructures and our local economies and our local services, but we do have to pick wisely, right? So that we're not coming up to 3 years and suddenly facing something where the growth didn't keep up and we can't afford what we just implemented anymore. The last thing I would say to that is that it's going to be interesting because all these towns are going to get their check in the mail and want to spend it right away, right? So it'll be interesting to see how this is all going to unfold across the state, because ideally we would be doing it in phases to avoid overwhelming the system, right? So if every town is investing in, let's say, their roads, the contracts go out, there's not going to be enough to go around. It's going to be really interesting to see how it's very different from the Great Recession when the projects that got funding were the ones that were shovel ready. Nobody else got one. This is a free for all. This is completely different. This is like, line up your wish list. Let's get it all done. Not so much, but like it is a very much more flexible route in terms of relief money from the federal government. And so it'll be really interesting to see how we're able to manage that in a way that doesn't overwhelm the supply chain, doesn't overwhelm, we could be up to full employment because we're fixing all the things. But where does that leave us 3 years from now, right? Are we going to be smart enough to phase it all in? And are we going to use the opportunity to do apprenticeships? Are we going to use the opportunity to do job training? Are we going to use, so they're all in a better place at the end of those 3 years?
Thank you. Thank you for raising that issue, Sheila. Deborah, you have the floor.
Thanks. So who benefits really depends entirely on how well we invest the money, right? We can benefit everybody and do garbage pickup twice as often with a whole lot of money, and it benefits everybody in maybe a way that isn't long lasting or really impactful. But when we look at local money and we look at local investments, and I don't want to minimize how important garbage pickup is in a local community. I know the council and the mayors are probably well aware of that. But I see, a large sum of money goes into our schools and our education. And I think we've seen the negative impact when we don't invest, right? For the 8 years under the prior state administration or Governor Christie, when schools were flat funded and it relied solely on a 2% cap, which we'll talk about later, to try to make up costs. Schools were basically flat funded, which always means less money because fixed costs go up, and our schools suffered, right? Class sizes might have gotten bigger, extracurriculars might have been cut back, parents may have been asked to invest more. And in some communities, a lot of parents can afford that. And in other communities, in the same communities, other families cannot afford that. So they become left behind. So I think where we talk about local investment, we have real opportunities to positively impact equity within our schools and to address some of the longer term consequences of flat funding over 8 years of the Christie administration. I also would be remiss if I didn't point out that public libraries are largely funded through local dollars. And that has a huge impact on equity and access, because libraries are a place that anybody can enter without judgment, without cost, to find resources and help and assistance they need. And it is very much a place where people who need job training or help with resume building or looking for English language courses, looking for help for their children in school, where they will go. And so when libraries flourish, it offers a litany of services and opportunity to everybody within the community, and many people who rely on services that don't cost and that they can enter safely. So I would also say it's the kind of place that we ought to think about building up when we think about what economic recovery looks like from COVID. And I'll cite another example. If we do our investments well, our outdoor spaces that are cared for by our municipalities, outdoor spaces have become so much more critical as gathering spaces in COVID. And you see it across the board, and Princeton, I'm sure, is actually an exception to this, but park investment is one of the first things that get cut when we're looking at municipal budgets that are struggling. You cut back on maintenance, and the next thing you know, you're not cutting the grass regularly and garbage accumulates, and then the gates are locked because it's not safe. These outdoor spaces are opportunities for local community to come together, to be healthy outside, to congregate, to give people physical activity and mental stress relief, which we know is a huge issue right now as a result of the pandemic. And so these are the spaces where people can really benefit. And in order to reinvent, I think every community has to look at their own ledger of where they've invested over the last years and decades and where they haven't been able to, and what reimagination would look like to put, to Sheila's point, on a long-term trajectory towards sustainable change, where you might need investment up front to achieve it. You might need investment up front to recover from loss of revenue from the pandemic. But on the other side of it, you have something sustainable and long-term, which you know benefits the community. So it's my hope, and it's my hope that through the level of voice that the governor will infuse, that President Biden is infusing, that we look towards investing with an eye on equity, with, as Nedia said, making sure that nobody's left behind, that it's a recovery for all, and that we look to advance our communities in new and meaningful ways. And I haven't even touched on a whole climate issue, where this is a real opportunity to make climate investments in changes that have been left behind, because you need capital investment at the front end that can lead to healthier communities for all. But I'll stop now before I go down my entire litany of laundry list, wish list, and dreams.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah, Sheila, and Nedia, for spotlighting the importance of investment in our local communities, and also the importance of equity, and ensuring that when we're thinking to invest in our communities, that we keep an eye on equity and are focusing on addressing some of the divides that have become so much more visible due to this pandemic. And with that, my next question is, as communities grow, for instance, due to an affordable housing settlement, should local government spending keep pace with that growth? Sheila, you have the floor.
Yes, I was looking at this before we started tonight, and I guess the question is, what is the metric for growth here, right? Are we talking about an assessed value of property, land, or, and what does it mean to keep pace? Are we talking about expanding services or ramping up support services for the vulnerable populations? It's a lot of gray, shades of gray here. So I would, push back a little bit, like to say, like, what are we looking for here in this question? Because the metric for growth could be so different.
So number of housing units. So Sheila, as we talked about communities growing, we were specifically referring to the number of affordable housing units growing as well. And should local government spending keep pace with that growth? And Deborah, would you like to add anything to that thought?
What I'll offer, and I was so thrilled that Sheila got to go first on this, because I think Sheila has much better expertise in this area. So what I offer is framed by this, which is that it's particular to a community where and how they should invest. But when, for example, new housing units come into a town, and ones that are aimed at being affordable and at achieving, a larger diversity of people with different incomes coming in, I think it is important to make sure that we match the services and resources to accommodate that growth. And most particular, given my years of work in education advocacy, I can say, sometimes we say we're building small 1-bedroom apartments, and I've heard this 1,000 times, they're not going to be big families. Well, I hate to break it to them, there might be families with kids, and it might increase school size. And so we have to think about what is the growth that you may need. And that's, one reason long-term facility planning for schools is important, that you have to look at your housing units coming into town as part of that, to anticipate it and be able to plan ahead. And I think it's also critically important to think about the resources that those new communities will need and how accessible they are, and whether you want to invest as a community in bringing that connectivity to the new houses, the new homes, and the new residents, and the services that they'll need to access. So should there be a commensurate investment? I can't really say, because I think it is particular to where a specific community is at a moment in time that they bring in these new homes. But I would certainly say that you want to keep pace, and that you want to keep pace in a way that helps, again, and I'm sorry to be on my soapbox, but that achieves equity. because it really doesn't help if you say that we have more people coming into town and therefore we want to open up more grocery stores. And I'm using a very, crude example, but we want to open up more grocery stores, and you put one at the opposite end of town, where there's already a Whole Foods, and now you put a Wegmans. So there's competition over there, but this side of town where the new houses have gone, there's still a food desert, right? So it's where you have your resources, how you're allocating them, and how you're projecting that growth realistically. Not wishfully, but realistically, I think is really important. And I'm not going to really touch on the topic of pilots except to raise them, but to say that, Sheila would be far better at me to talk about it, but that you have to be really careful about the revenue that you forego when you bring in new development, so that you're not sacrificing the commensurate development within the community that supports those new residents.
Yeah, thank you for that assist. Can I redo my answer? No, I'm kidding. I want to add that, there's this could be, we could also be talking about economic development, right? A business comes in town, everyone gets to cut the ribbon, and it's great because there's new jobs, right? Well, with new jobs comes more traffic, more families moving into homes, more pressure on the services that the town is offering. And you just hope that the economic benefit of the new development or the new business in town will balance out, right? The increased need for these services. When you do see growth within a state, in a local government's finances, usually the first thing that the extra cash will go to is the wage and salaries of the public employees who are working in local government, because that's 70% of your budget normally. So when we do see a local government having an infusion of new growth, new taxable, increased rateables of their local businesses, it tends to be, welcomed, but it's really a tricky thing to say, okay, so what does this mean? Do we ramp up support for services for our vulnerable communities? Do we finally have, pay off a debt? Or are we basically going back to the biggest pot and saying, okay, yes, these employees have said that they haven't had a raise in 5 years. It most typically ends up going towards your labor, your workforce in the local government. And it's, it ends up being the priorities that are flushed out when you see growth happening, fiscally happening on the local level. When at the same time, there's all these external forces that are pushing, your community to be to be welcoming for all, housing developments. And but at the same time, you could have this argument with the idea that a business is moving into town. Either way, there should be a level playing field to say these are both economically viable and both economically advantageous to our town, because of the the local growth that it inspires, or that it encourages, when you have more business in town and more families spending money. And yeah, you just hope that it ends up eating out with the increased services.
Thank you. And such an important issue to talk about, the increased services as we're growing. And this issue came up earlier. I'm going to circle back to something that was brought up earlier during this panel discussion. In 2007, Governor John Corzine signed legislation capping property tax increases at 4%. 2 years later, Chris Christie signed legislation lowering the cap to 2%. Without debating New Jersey's reliance on property taxes to fund government, is it time for the cap to be raised or abolished? I would love to get your thoughts on that. Deborah, do you want to get us kicked off?
Sure, put me in the hot seat on this one. I want to be clear that as a representative of Governor Murphy, and he has not taken a position on this, so I will give some thoughts on it, but neither representative of the governor nor of a policy position we've taken. But I will say two things. the first has to do with perception of taxes. And I heard a number of years ago, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the study to look it up, but it was out of an Israeli university on the differing perspectives of taxes around the world. And in some nations, they're really viewed as a socially positive contribution to our collective benefit. And in some places, they're writ large viewed as a burden that we should all try to minimize the amount we have to pay. And it was a really interesting study on how perception of taxes influences what we want to pay, what we want to pay for, and how we even engage in the discussion. And so I think that, you know, in the United States writ large, we tend more towards, and the study bore this out, like taxes are a burden, we should pay as little as possible and you know, try to keep as much as we can for ourselves. That is a framework within which we have to look at the property tax piece. The second thing I'll say is that, and this is something the governor talks about frequently, property taxes are, as you've said, are noted to be very high in the state, but there is a value to what we get that is larger than the property tax bill itself. And because of the hyper-local way that the state functions, a lot of tax burden is at the local level, where there is local control and where there is local investment. And if that's done well, and a community is behind those investments and participatory in the decision-making, and there's transparency about where the money is going, then I believe you can have a community that will want to raise the taxes necessary for the collective benefit that they decide is appropriate. It is a big lift to have to make that go to vote if you want it above 2%. But I think that the reason we have to be really careful around the topic of caps is that we don't have that deep level of engagement and connectivity of communities to decision makers. So too often decision makers go in one direction and a community is left holding the bag. So if we were to lift caps, I would just say it needs to be done within a framework of deep community collaboration and input, so that those investments are truly reflective of what the community wants and needs, and that it's done with, with equity, and that it's done in a way that lifts everybody up. So I am not Ernie Rourke. I cannot really comment on the impact of tax caps over the length of time like he could have. And I said to Sheila before we started that almost everything I know came from Ernie about municipal taxes, and he gave insights every day that I treasure and try to remember. But what I will say is that we have to approach this with a sense of the value that we're getting writ large, not just in terms of the bill on my home, and that we have to do it in a way that makes sure that those local dollars, those property tax local dollars, come back to the community in a way that they have decided collectively is the direction they want to drive the community in, and that will be true with the additional funds coming in as much as with the annual property taxes.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's critical to engage the community as we talk about increasing taxes and what those taxes go towards. Sheila, we would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, the other piece of the 2% tax that cap that Chrissy put in is that he also limited a 2% cap. He also limited the contract settlement for public safety employees, fire and policemen. So the binding arbitrary settlements. So those together, the 2% cap and the contract settlement provision, they really did reverse property tax increases. Loopholes were closed as well. There used to be like 15 loopholes. We're down to like 4. So it did the job it was supposed to do, right? We did slow down in terms of property taxes increases being out of control, and it's forced hard decisions in municipalities, especially schools, right? And again, this all goes back to labor costs. So if the cap is going to change, I mean, we can already predict that the bulk of the new spending will probably go to labor costs, health benefits, and the like, because there's always the need. Contract settlements are just part of the game. But that being said, there's new costs that have come up since the 2% cap went into place, and specifically tech spending. IT infrastructure within our school systems has, just skyrocketed in terms of usage because of the pandemic. And that has all these associated costs, replacing laptops, cybersecurity, this is a new cost that is not going to go away. In fact, it's just become the norm. Every kid's got a laptop. So since the cap has been put into place, you have to wonder, like, well, how does this play out? Like, how are we going to do this in the long term as education, for instance, evolves and quite frankly becomes more expensive? That's just one example. I think that, again, local government is going to be reliant on assessments, and that's all they can really do if they are facing new costs. I don't have an opinion either way about whether we should get rid of it or if we should maybe put it up to 3%. But I will say that it has kind of slowed down that spending that has been happening. Property taxes is, it's the reality of living in New Jersey. Land is extremely valuable here. We're between two major world markets in Philadelphia and New York City. We're the most densely populated state. Land is valuable. That's just the end of all of it, right? And so we're never going to get out of this pickle, basically, of unless we strip the entire tax code and start it all over again. And it's just not going to happen. But I will give the cap some credit to like just slowing this down a little bit. But again, looking into the future, things are going to be changing. And we have to be able to be nimble enough to react to that. So toss-up answer for you. Sorry about that.
No, thank you. You raised some really important issues. And with that, we move to our final question of the evening from the PCDO before we move into audience Q&A. So
Hey, Afshin, I don't think Nedia was given the chance to answer this.
Yeah, so Nedia and I had communicated ahead of time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we're good.
All right.
Afshin,
Good.
could I add quickly one thing? Where
Yes,
there's
yes,
been a
please.
debate to Sheila's point, there's been a debate around districts that are losing funding under the S2 formula. I'm about to get very granular very quickly, but briefly. Districts that are losing state level funding because they have by the formula been overfunded, and their fair share, their local fair share, is way under where the formula says they should be. And in that space, for example, there is a discussion about whether to raise the cap for them, because even at the 2% cap, they won't be able to get to the local fair share that the S2 transitions expects them to. Those are the spaces where I believe we should be talking about cap relief, because there's a very specific clause and reason for it, but it still should be based within the community, I believe. But sorry, I just wanted to add like a specific example on where the debates exist and I think are worthy to be had.
Thank you for raising that important point. And with that, we're going to move into our final question from the PCDO this evening. And after that, I'm going to invite our Programming Committee Chair, Tim Quinn, to moderate our Q&A from the audience. So our last question is, how can local communities best leverage federal efforts, such as the Recovery Act and infrastructure and climate bills, to help advance progressive initiatives on the local level? Nedia, you have the floor.
Yeah, I'll put my youth power hat on. So one of the things that young people really across the country have been fighting for, even before the existence of body cameras, has been the investment in Black and Brown communities of resources in lieu of police and security and policing in our schools. We, after the murder of George Floyd, I'm sure many folks saw this, but lots of schools took the bold decision of, in the events that they had contracts with police or had contracts with SROs, the new way that the federal and state governments are reclassifying essentially what are police in schools, decided to break those contracts and decided to incorporate student voice so that we were, investing more heavily in college access resources, after school programming, quality lunch. And that same work can be done here in New Jersey, right? We already know that those recovery federal funds are not at all earmarked for, policing or security, but it will fall on the shoulders of all of the school districts across the state to think about how they want to invest the money that comes their way. And it's just imperative that we are underlining for our school districts that we want that invested, just like to what Sheila was saying, the infrastructure that it requires to get ready if you need to go back remote, or, the mental health resources that people across the gamut are, need now and will continue to need as we head into a reopening plan, right? We know that, going virtual has been an intense mental burden for lots of young people, K through 12. And that's what we need to be investing in, right? We don't need to be investing in more police on school grounds, more security on school grounds, more metal detectors, right? In our community here in Elizabeth, just before we went on COVID break, we brought in Newark airport style metal detectors inside of our schools, but we still only have one counselor for every 587 students. Is that how we want to really be investing our funds? We want to, we're second best in education, but the segregation and the inequalities among school districts is intense. And I think, the advocacy that we can do at our local school district level to push for police, no policing and investment in counselors and resources that allow students to thrive definitely should be priority.
I couldn't agree with you more. That's a really critical point that you raise about advocating for resources that our children really need, as opposed to investing in things that we're scared of and see as preventative, but really cause harm. Thank you for raising those issues, Nedia. Sheila, you have the floor.
So how can local communities best leverage the federal aid when it comes down the pike, infrastructure and climate? It's a great question. In some ways, it's too soon to tell, right? We're still waiting for the rules from Treasury to get real clarity on what we can spend this money on and what we can't. But if if it's obvious, one thing that I hope that local communities will do is to invest in what you know. I think it's a smarter way to go. Invest in the things that you have invested in before to further your resiliency when it comes to climate change. It's a little bit trickier when you say, well, let's spend it on electric buses. Let's just do it. Let's just get the whole new fleet, or at least start beginning doing that. And it's so kind of cutting edge that in the next 3 to 5 years, there might be a better fleet, or they don't make that battery anymore. Or so I would be cautious about being on the forefront of new technology, or being on the forefront of, we're the first municipality to have this kind of bus, or this kind of garbage truck. It's very tempting, but it's just like an electric bike. The batteries have become lighter, and just wait a couple more years and the technology will just be a little bit better and a little bit cheaper, and you won't have to worry about that company going out of business to replace this part. I would just be cautious about that sort of forward-thinking investment, and just invest in the things that the bread and butter of a municipality, but things that, of course, will address the need to be prepared for large climate events or displacement. Refiguring like what areas of town are the most vulnerable, and maybe it's time to invest in moving those people out of those homes and just letting that part of the town, what I'm saying? Like, do the things that are kind of an obvious fix instead of pushing the envelope, right?
Thank you so much for those words of caution. Really sound advice. Deborah, you have the floor.
Sure. How can you leverage it? So I'm gonna offer a slightly more practical bend to this one, less policy and more tactic, I think. The first is be prepared. We're waiting on federal guidance still, but be having the discussions right now. What do you envision? What do you want? Start having those community discussions, and they should be robust at the community, county, and state level, because we all have layered involvement in these issues. The second thing I would say is to be bold and be courageous. And I agree with the cautionary words of Sheila, but I would also say at least allow yourself to dream big as part of this process. That's how we get to reimagination. Don't feel constrained by the status quo. And then my third point, though, is the measure to that, which is to be realistic about the complexities and the risks. So you can't reimagine if you don't think big. But then you have to take those big ideas and say, what can we realistically and well accomplish in the time that we have and the money that we have, given the risks and the changing natures and the priorities. So dream big, but then prioritize and be realistic. I would say the next thing is to really make sure that you're involved at all levels. So there should be at the local level, good local involvement, but if you ignore the county and the state, you'll be missing the boat, because they'll set up parameters, conditions, constraints, guardrails, and opportunities that may or may not be aligned with your priorities. So always have the big picture, right? And up to the federal government as well. And I would say that this is an opportunity to really think about leveraging funds, but also leveraging democracy in a different way, because so often the discussions we've had to have around money over the past decade at least have been zero-sum games. I want money for here, which means you won't have money there, and you won't have money there if I want money here, right? I always say in the tables we sit around is that there's, you know, everybody's only asking in their own words for $5 million, but when you add up that $5 million around the table, you're at 500 million. But here, there is a new infusion of money coming in a way that not every discussion has to be zero sum, which means there's an opportunity to build consensus in a way that hasn't existed in zero sum frameworks. And so I think it's really worth the investment of that infrastructure of engagement right now, because that will inform decisions. It will lead to decisions that stakeholders are supportive of. It will be inclusive of perspectives that leadership may not always have at the table. And it will assure that there is a long-term community and commitment to the success of the investment, as well as, and we always know, whenever there's a large infusion of cash coming into anything, transparency and accountability are big pieces of it. So I would encourage everybody to be prepared, to be involved, to think big and be practical all at the same time. And that the Princeton community is incredibly strong in these areas already. So I would probably say that the rest of the state is going to be looking at what you're going to be doing as a role model and example for what we could be doing writ large.
Thank you, Deborah. And I love the focus on community engagement as part of this thinking and this process. Thank you, everyone. And now I'm going to invite our programming committee chair, Tim Quinn, to moderate our audience Q&A. Tim, you have the floor.
Hi. First of all, this discussion so far and the panelists have just been awesome. And I think like golf claps are in order for all of you. We have some questions that were posted in the Q&A. There's a long one here that I'll attempt to articulate in the manner in which it was left. What is left of the state's infrastructure for refugee resettlement after the wrecking ball of the Christie administration? Biden has assured us the Trump tourniquet on refugee admissions will be lifted, certainly by the next fiscal year, and we hope sooner. In Trenton, meaning the city of Trenton, we've been hoping for a major resettlement of, say, Syrian and Iraqi refugees, but what will be there to support their absorption? It's a toss-up question, so anyone is welcome to be first in.
Deb, you are probably the only one. I mean, maybe Nedia too.
I don't know. I was thinking Nedia is closer to a lot of the policies, and I'm not sure I have a clear enough understanding on what is being asked, except to say that, you know, from day one of the day one of the Murphy administration, we have committed deeply to rebuilding, and this was under Trump, right? To rebuilding our state's infrastructure to welcoming and supporting immigrants into the state. And so this was done in contrast to what Trump was doing. And we were, I think, you know, fairly bold about not worrying about coming. In fact, I think it was a badge of honor when we would do things that would run in opposition to what Trump was doing. So we have been very engaged with that at the state level, the Office of New Americans, the directives out of the Attorney General's office, the investment in legal representation for people who are being detained are, are small examples of things we've done in the past, looking to get to cover all kids so that all children can have access to healthcare regardless of immigration status, of things that we're looking to do moving forward. I think we're extremely hopeful now that we have better partners at the federal level, that we can do more, do better, and do bigger. And that's one of the reasons that we're anticipating with, a great deal of hope, the rescue plan guidance from the federal government, because Trump did put on his CRF money, his original COVID money, some really strict guardrails around the use of it for people who are undocumented. And we don't anticipate those same guardrails to be up under the Biden administration, which will open up much more flexibility for how we can make sure this is a recovery for all and then moving forward. We've also done a lot of things around education, and I should say Dreamers and that, but I don't want to just go through the list. But here's the challenge, and this is what I've learned after years of being in grassroots organizing and shifting into government, is that it is just way more complex to move the battleship than we would ever like. And it's a little bit like habits, right? Like a bad habit is really fast to form and then hard to break. And it's a little bit, and I say this with full political ideological bias, it was relatively easy through a number of Trump's executive orders to do really bad things really quickly. Undoing them takes a lot of time because you need infrastructure that goes with it. You need support systems, and all of those things were dismantled under Trump. So I think we have to be patient, and we have to pressure, and we have to keep the voices heard, but we have to be supportive of those efforts, because we know that the Biden administration is moving in the direction we want them to go in, but we have to acknowledge that to do it, we have to do it well. We can't just open up borders if we don't have the proper supportive environment for people to come into, if we don't have a better system to welcome people and support them when they get here. So and that's just a tiny example of the things we have to work on and fix. And it's not that easy. It's not that easy in state government. It's not that easy in federal government. I know it feels like it should be, but then when you get into the complexities of it, it's not. And so we're, I think, all headed in the right direction. We have a ways to go, and it should be done collaboratively to make sure that it's done with deep integrity and with proper investment of funds, so that everybody is given a chance to not just come here and be supported, but then have pathways to legal status. And that's obviously a whole nother bucket we have to fix and address.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback off what Deb just said, I think the Office of New Americans that the administration has opened is, I think we can expect incredible things from them, like specifically on refugee resettlement. I know that like one of the projects they've just started is like collaborating and talking with other states to think about like, how are we supporting people transfer like licenses or getting credentialing from their native countries, like accepted in New Jersey, and then how are they connecting them with the like appropriate agencies so they can actually use that license or that credentialing in effect. So like, the Office of New Americans is really a great like think space for this. They're doing that type of work. And if you haven't seen their brochure, I will actually drop it in the chat of like, some of the priorities that they have for the next couple of years, but I think that's a great space for it. And of course, right, we're extremely disappointed by Biden's continuation of the refugee cap that they announced last week.
Okay, thank you. And there's a question about reducing prison populations. How can we reduce the prison population and help those in prison and make their lives safer and grow their potential to succeed when they leave?
You want me to start?
You can start. And then I'll heap praise on Murphy administration.
So, we've done a lot to decrease our prison populations in New Jersey in the course of this administration. And with that has come the need to shift resources. So this year's budget does reflect, for example, moving some of the DOC funding that would go to halfway houses into resources on reentry and resources on preparing people to re-enter. Some of those are things like a better internet service within the prison system, which is foundational to people being able to communicate or look for jobs or get documents and papers ready for when they are released. And some of them are more of the reentry programs that we're trying to make more robust across the state. to make sure people have their IDs in hand when they leave, to make sure that they have access to the medical care and housing assistance they need, and to support the organizations that are doing that work on the ground. So it is again, one of those things which seems like, from my perspective, when I was an organizer, it should be pretty straightforward, but it is always more complex, because when people are released fully, not on probation or parole, they have no obligation to tell us where they may go, where they may look for housing, or what assistance they may want or need. So all you can do is make services available to them. You cannot pinpoint where they will go and then make sure they're connected to services. They can voluntarily share that information and we can work collaboratively. So a lot of it is changing the culture around reentry and around release, so that it is something that is done collaboratively across state government, county, municipal governments have been asking to get involved around reentry services and around social services, around medical, housing, addiction, education, job training, and how do you bring those together? And so there's many departments across state government working on many elements of that, of integrating and providing a more holistic service. And there's a steep budget shifting of resources reflective of where we're going. And for those of you who are, watching the caucus calendar, you know that tomorrow there will be another bill that is due on mandatory minimums from the governor. So we'll be taking, further steps to address reducing prison populations in meaningful ways and making sure that they have second chances. And I will just add that as part of that, the removal of the ban of probation and parolees from voting was really, really important, because we know that the more ways that you engage people in community, the better chance you have of them thriving in those communities. And so having people come out on parole and probation and being able to immediately be part of that process, that democratic process, makes them a stakeholder instead of disenfranchised. It's another little piece. There's no single magic bullet, but it's lots of these little pieces combined together to get where we're going. With respect to the quality of life in prison, we obviously have had, a laser focus on the atrocities at Edna Mahan. There is new oversight in there. There is a task force that's being formed for that oversight. There's the federal oversight, then there's the state task force that was already in design. And we have to do much more about creating transparency in those spaces and critical accountability, so that we never see those kinds of atrocities happen again. And we need to hold everybody to the same standards. I was educated long ago that when you are incarcerated, you may give up your freedom, but you don't give up your rights. We have to make sure that we are protecting and defending the rights of everybody who is in prison, as we would for anybody who is not.
Well said, Deb. I would just add a couple things on this administration also opened up more opportunities for higher education in the prisons, as well as the opportunity to, well, there's so many, when you read the budget line by line, like some of us, there's so many re-entry programs that the state provides. It's really impressive. Something that we should, be proud of, because it fundamentally tells you the value that the state puts in to what happens after a person has served their term. And then the other great, I believe that the state has also helped those who have been incarcerated, gave them back their voting rights, right? Is that what was that was one of the new things under the administration as well, which is really admirable. It just shows another value that your crime is not who you are, and that you have every right to live a life of dignity and prosperity after you have served your term. So the only other thing I'll add to that is that there is a movement to close the remaining youth prisons that exist in New Jersey, and a really well-run campaign to do so. The Institute for Social Justice, I highly recommend looking into their campaign and supporting it any way you can, because this is just another piece of the puzzle of decriminalizing, or just taking away these spaces that are inappropriate for crimes that youth may have committed, and coming up with alternatives. And I think New Jersey is well primed to take that next leap into a better way of helping youth who have interfaced with the criminal justice system.
Nedia, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, no, I was just going to bring up the effort to end youth prisons, and I think I forget where the stat I found it was. I was trying to look for it now, but just to what Deb was saying before, I think New Jersey actually released like the most amount of prisoners in a single day. I can't remember like out of what, in New Jersey's history ever, but still very exciting. And then I think putting in place that no one who was released during COVID should be returned, and of course ending immigration detention. We have 3 operating detention centers, and we know that folks are detained there, and those we want to end immigration detention for all.
Thank you. There was a question about, and first acknowledging that no one in here is an economist. There was a question about it was a 2-part question expressing a concern about possible inflation due to injecting so much federal money into the economy. I don't know whether any of you want to touch that, but there was also a concern that increased spending, the possible consequences for people on fixed incomes and low incomes, I'm assuming, who are property owners. So I know that for the benefit of the people in the audience, we are doing a panel on property tax in June. So that's why we sort of artfully crafted the question. But does anyone want to talk to either of those points? The investment, how it affects people on fixed incomes, or concerns about inflation?
I mean, I'll offer on concerns about inflation that very grateful that we have a Fed that we can work with, because those are where the actions I think would really be taken. And as you said, not an economist, legitimate concern, but something that we would have to look to the Feds to really address. On the fixed income piece, I would say that this is something, Governor holds very near and dear, from birth through the Nurture NJ program, pre-birth to, retirement and living out the years of not working in New Jersey. He wants New Jersey to be a place where people can live, afford to live, thrive in, and succeed. And so he, across the age groups and points in life, wants to make sure we're addressing that. And so I think this is one of those places where contributory voices about the investment, about A, the impact that COVID's had to people on fixed incomes, and B, the investments that we could make that would meaningfully assist and change are a critical piece of a recovery that includes everybody. There's obviously a lot of talk around homestead rebates and other tax rebate plans that have been over the past decade funded at various levels and come out at various times. But there's pieces around pharmaceutical drug expenses and access to virtual or in-person medical care. There's all pieces of it that we have to look at together to make sure that we assist everybody along every point in their lives. And this includes, there are people who are younger years on fixed income as well. We need to address that. So excuse me. I didn't see that one coming. So I think we have, a lot of good work to do, and I would ask and encourage input. If whomever sent that comment and has any specific suggestions or contributions, we would welcome them.
Anyone else care to comment on that, or we can move on to the next question? So Deborah, I think that that you're going to be first up on this one, and it's an issue that is near and dear to a lot of people in Princeton. And the question specifically is, does Governor Murphy consider his commitment to create a state public bank factor into this long-term investment strategy? So where are we with the state bank?
So the task force is meeting on the state bank and has been doing some really great work at figuring out both where it can be most impactful if it were to be stood up, and how it can be structured and capitalized, which is one of the major challenges, right? The organizer in me would love to say, ooh, federal infusion of cash, there's capitalization for the bank. Like, it seems easy to me, except of course, the federal government doesn't give a state a lump sum of money to put in their own bank to figure out then how to spend. So it can't be quite that easy. I will say that while the work slowed down a little bit during the pandemic also gave, I think, a really critical lens on the work that the state bank can do to benefit the state. So it's been, I think, a very valuable, slower process than we might have anticipated. I think that the board members and those working in state are still looking for those capitalization pieces, because how much you can capitalize and with what state funds really determines what levels of investment you can make utilizing the state bank. And then it's also obviously very complex because we also, we have the infrastructure bank, we have other banks that exist. They don't operate like a state bank would, but they exist with some capitalized funds available, and how they all interface and how the laws are written is just a really difficult challenge. So it's one of those things that the governor, whenever you ask him, he'll tell you he's frustrated it's not further along, but he's pleased at the progress that it's making, and it's well worth the effort and the time that we're giving it. I do think that as part of the American Recovery Plan, coming from the federal government, we should be looking at the ways, even if the ARP money can't capitalize the state bank, but that it could intersect with those kinds of long-term structural changes we're talking about. And I know that's a discussion that the task force has had in mind. The executive order, I should just flag, did require some public hearings on the state bank, and I anticipate those will be coming out, probably virtual, but that will be coming out in the next 6 months or a year. They want to hold them a little bit spaced apart so they can talk at different points along the line. So there will be formal opportunity to input, but if anybody here has suggestions, ideas, or input, the board has always been welcome to hearing contributions to round out the thought process here.
Thank you. And it's incumbent upon we Democrats that we get the governor reelected in order to realize some of these goals that have been pushed into the second term. Any thoughts from the other panelists on the state bank? That was sort of a Deb specific.
Deb knocked it out of the park.
So there's a question about affordable housing, and not just capital A, capital H affordable housing as in subsidized housing, but how can we make housing more affordable for everyone in New Jersey who spends more than 35% of their income for housing? And how are we helping with evictions and foreclosures?
Well, do you want to take the evictions and foreclosures, Deb?
Sure. I mean, I'll just,
go ahead.
I'll briefly say that our moratorium continues. Our moratorium is not a solution. It is a temporary Band-Aid on what will be a huge problem if we don't get it done, and that to get it done well, we really need to see legislation move. There are certain things we can do to assist in the housing crisis without legislation, but the structural fixes need to be done in collaboration. So we appreciate the tremendous support from activists and advocates in working with us and the legislature. And we're not there yet, but we need to hunker down and get there pretty soon, because if all goes well, we should be coming out of a public health emergency over the course of this calendar year. And we need to have those in place. And it's obviously it's a municipal, county, state, federal, national problem that we all have to address. And we anticipate support coming from the feds to help us deal with it, but we have to have the structure in place to do so.
Yes, completely agree. I mean, New Jersey did have a foreclosure crisis that never recovered, never really ended after the Great Recession. And so there are structural changes there that have to be made too. And you're right, they do have to go through the legislative process. Again, the pandemic brought this issue to the forefront again, that we don't have enough in New Jersey. We don't have enough places for people to live that are affordable, and that the cost of living here is very high. Thankfully, we have a governor that recognized that we needed a better minimum wage than we had in the past. That is being phased in, and you could argue that $15 isn't even it, right? It could be 20, especially in a state like New Jersey, where we do have a high cost of living here. But yes, this is going to be an ongoing issue. We do have systems at the state level. Affordable Housing Trust Fund has been there for many years. The governor's done a great job in wheeling back on rating that fund in order to cover everyday bills that are in the budget, thanks to taking a stronger role in raising the revenue that's necessary for New Jersey's state budget. But yes, this is an ongoing issue, and we actually have excellent advocates here in the state of New Jersey for housing. And so, yeah, the fight goes on. Nedia, do you have something to add?
Yeah, no, only the 15 piece. I think it's totally right. Like, once upon a time, 15 was incredibly radical and seemingly impossible. And then we won it. And now it feels more like, the new wave might be 25 by 25. So I think lots of opportunity to just put money in people's hands. It's another great plug for Recovery for All. People have been unable to pay their rent because they don't have a means to pay their rent, right? The savings have been exhausted, if there was ever any savings, because the cost of living is already so high, has been exhausted on bills and food and, medicine. And so, providing recovery for, 500,000 people is not the total answer, but it's part of the solution.
Thanks.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your answer. And I think it's time for me to get out of here and turn it back over to Afshin. Thank you so much for participating in this panel. It's just been awesome. And I wish we had more time, but this was time well spent. So you can kick me out now, Afshin.
Thanks so much, Tim, but we want to keep you. I'm just moving you to a different space. So thank you. I echo Tim's words. This panel was awesome. Thank you so much for touching on so many important issues. And thank you to our audience for so many great questions. And with that, I'm going to invite our panelists to share their closing thoughts. And then we're going to wrap up the program. Sheila, would you like to get us started?
Sure. I guess it can't be said enough that the American relief plan that is, it really does have far-reaching consequences for millions of families, right? And it really does have the potential of blowing off the doors of austerity politics once and for all, because it's geared towards those who have suffered the most, specifically children in poverty, with cash in hand, right, through the tax credits. And then on the local level, it is just an incredible infusion of cash for infrastructure projects that are in some cases long overdue. This is really a sea change on how government has treated families who have been hit hard by hard times in the past. It really symbolizes what NJPP has long championed as a central component of a strong economy, that you treat everyone with dignity and equality, and they deserve the targeted policies that foster economic security. And if you do that, your economy is going to grow, right? And in many ways, New Jersey is ahead of the curve on this. We spent 4 years during the previous federal administration pushing progressive, forward-thinking policy over and over and over again. I mean, minimum wage, we talked about, the public health insurance option, worker protections like earned sick days and paid leave, wage theft ban was put into place. We've done this good work because we recognize that it's okay to be unapologetically bold about wanting people to have a life of dignity and a life of prosperity, and to not just get by, but to get ahead. And that's really important. And you see those values reflected in the federal plan that is coming down the pike. And it just reinforces everything that we've been fighting for at NJPP for years. And I think it's just a finally, like trickle down economics has kind of died that death, right? But so does the idea that if cutting costs is going to help you get through a tough time. It's not. And we're excited to see what Princeton does with their stimulus money.
Thanks so much, Sheila. We share your excitement about that. So, thank you so much for your advocacy at the New Jersey Policy Perspectives, for all the work you're doing on behalf of our most vulnerable communities. Just incredible advocacy, and thank you for being here tonight. Nedia, I invite you to share your closing remarks.
Yeah, for sure. I know I mentioned this like some way midpoint, but I think it bears repeating that, New Jersey's 10 billionaires made 1.7, like their net worth increased 1.7 billion during the first 5 months of the pandemic. And then folks just stopped counting because, that's already a number so large to go off of for forever. I think it's, and they were making so much money on the backs of essential workers, low income workers, working class people, many of whom are excluded from relief up until right now, more than 385 days later. That's how they were able to make their millions. And we, are only going to be able to get out of this pandemic if we are servicing those people, right? We have lost so many of them already, right? They have not only died because they have contracted COVID, because they had no decision but to go and show up to work, but also because of the state's lack of response, right? And the legislature's lack of response, right? There was a bill that was floating around, for some time, but we haven't had legislators come and pick it up again, right? Take action on what we're doing and how we're rebuilding for the future. And, maybe we're able to get out of this pandemic in a few months, but the consequences and the repercussions of having left an entire community behind will impact us for decades, right? Young people who, haven't had, quality access to food, are not really present in virtual learning. Their Wi-Fi connection is shot because their parents aren't able to, spend an extra $20 a month for, optimum premium or what have you, are going to fall behind. Students who, were relying on their parents to help them meet the remainder of their tuition fee for that semester just didn't go, or maybe they were the only ones in their family who had legal status. They opted out for a year or for an entire semester so they could work, right? The impact of having left behind, 500,000 people, and there are more than 200,000 US citizen children, could hurt us for a very, very long time. And, obviously they have already felt the hurt themselves. And so, we're really hopeful and excited, to see if Princeton can stand right alongside with this effort to push the legislature, to act on recovery for all as soon as possible.
Thank you so much, Nedia, for shining a light on the inequities that are particularly glaring during this pandemic, and for all your advocacy work at Make the Road New Jersey to address those inequities. With that, I'm going to invite Deborah to share her closing thoughts.
Thank you. It's been a true honor and always really kind of nourishing to the soul and to the intellect to be parts of these conversations. So incredibly grateful for the opportunity. I think from my perspective, I would say that there's, I can't think of a more important and more exciting time to be involved in policy and politics. And to do policy, you have to be involved in politics. So to do both, there is so much opportunity. There's so much at stake, and there's so much we can do if we come together to decide that while we may not always agree, we may not agree with a state decision or a municipal decision or the federal government's decision. We may think a bill should be bigger or a bill should be less. But if we can acknowledge that we have this opportunity in front of us and we will make the best use of it for transformational change if we do it together, and we don't let the divisions that have been so deeply kind of fostered and nourished under the previous federal administration define us, we have this amazing opportunity in front of us. So I see it as this incredibly exciting time to redouble our efforts to strengthening our democracy through participation and engagement, education, transparency, and inclusion. And that if we do that well, with intention and with integrity, we come out, I hope, meeting the high standards that Nedia and Make the Road have set for us, that this is a recovery for all, that means that we change the nature of the dialogue. We have so much work to do, but we have so much good opportunity to do it right now. So I would just say thank you for having this session, which demonstrates what we know about Princeton to be a community of deeply engaged people who want to serve and want to contribute both to your own communities, to the state writ large, and to beyond. And that I would just ask you to continue to lead in that and to bring additional people along, to invite your friends and neighbors and your families to take advantage of this opportunity and to become more involved, because that's the way we will succeed as an economic recovery, as a health recovery, and as a democratic nation, building a stronger future for everybody.
Thank you, Deborah. And it's so poignant that every crisis presents an opportunity. And so thank you for illuminating that for us once again, and that and your focus on community engagement, particularly for this administration, and your closing remarks, so important and so critical, and have been a great way that the governor's office and you have provided tremendous leadership in our state, particularly during this pandemic. That brings us to our close in this evening, and many thanks to our esteemed panelists for joining us today and for this wonderful discussion. It was truly amazing, and thanks once again to PCDO's programming chair Tim Quinn and our programming committee for all their work to bring us this amazing panel discussion. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and we look forward to seeing everyone at our May membership meeting. More details to follow soon. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.